She moved quietly between the tables, balancing 2 plates in one hand and a tray in the other, her steps steady and practiced. The hall was full that evening, filled with soft laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of conversations that never seemed to stop. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow across polished floors. Everything in the room looked perfect, almost like a picture that had been carefully arranged. And in the middle of all that perfection, she remained almost invisible. It had been years since she started working there. At first, the place had felt overwhelming. The guests spoke in confident tones, dressed in clothes that looked too expensive to even touch. She had worried about making mistakes, spilling a drink, forgetting an order, or saying the wrong thing. But time had shaped her into someone efficient and calm. Now she moved through the crowd without drawing attention, doing her job with quiet focus. Most people never looked at her for more than a second. To them, she was just part of the service, like the neatly folded napkins or the polished silverware. Some guests were polite, offering a quick smile or a soft thank you. Others barely acknowledged her presence. She had learned not to mind. It was easier that way. But there was one thing in the hall that always pulled her attention, no matter how busy she was. In the far corner stood a grand piano. It was glossy black, its surface reflecting the lights above. During special evenings, professional musicians would sit there, filling the room with soft melodies that blended perfectly with the atmosphere. Sometimes it was slow and calming, other times lively and bright. The guests enjoyed it without thinking too much about it. For them, it was just another part of the experience. For her, it was something else entirely. Every time she passed by, her eyes would linger on it for just a moment longer than necessary. It was never obvious. She made sure of that. Just a quick glance, a small pause that no one seemed to notice. Then she would move on, returning to her work as if nothing had happened. But inside, something always stirred. That evening was no different. She adjusted the edge of a tablecloth and straightened a set of glasses before stepping back. The piano was quiet tonight. No one was playing it. It stood there untouched, almost waiting. For a brief second, she found herself staring at it again, her expression softening in a way that didn't match the busy environment around her. A voice pulled her back. A guest was calling for assistance, and she quickly turned, her face returning to its usual calm expression. She walked over, took the order, and nodded politely. Her movements were smooth, her voice steady. No one could tell that just a moment ago, her thoughts had been somewhere else entirely. As the night went on, the crowd grew larger. More people arrived, filling every corner of the hall. The air carried a mix of perfumes and freshly prepared food. Laughter grew louder, conversations overlapped, and the rhythm of the evening picked up. She kept working, moving from one table to another without pause. But even in the middle of all that noise, her awareness of the piano never faded. At one point, she passed close enough to it that she could see her reflection faintly on its surface. She slowed down, just slightly, her fingers tightening around the tray she was holding. For a split second, it looked as if she might stop. But she didn't. She walked past it like she always did. There had been a time long ago when things were very different. Back then, her world had not been filled with trays and orders. It had been filled with something else, something she had not allowed herself to think about for a long time. Life had changed suddenly, in ways she never expected. Responsibilities came first, and dreams slowly faded into the background. What once felt important became something distant, almost unreal, and over time she learned to live without it. Or at least that's what she told herself. The truth was, some things never really leave. They stay hidden, waiting quietly. A group of guests near the center of the hall burst into laughter, drawing attention from nearby tables. She walked over with a polite smile, placing their drinks carefully in front of them. One of them thanked her, barely looking up. She nodded and stepped back, already moving on to the next task. The night continued like that, busy, loud, and full of movement. And yet, in between all the noise, there were small, quiet moments. Moments when she found herself looking toward the piano again. Moments when her steps slowed just slightly as she passed by. Moments when her expression changed, just for a second. No one noticed. To everyone else, she was just doing her job. As the evening reached its peak, the energy in the room shifted. The conversations became more animated, the laughter louder. Some guests leaned back in their chairs, clearly enjoying themselves, while others stood in small groups, talking and smiling. The piano remained untouched. It almost felt out of place, standing there in silence while everything else carried on around it. She noticed that too. And this time, when she glanced at it, something in her expression lingered a little longer than usual. It wasn't just a look. It was a memory, a quiet echo of something she had once known very well. She quickly looked away, as if afraid someone might see that side of her. She adjusted her posture and continued walking, focusing on the tasks in front of her. There were orders to take, dishes to clear, and guests to attend to. There was no time to think about the past. Still, the feeling didn't completely disappear. It stayed with her, just beneath the surface. The kind of feeling that doesn't demand attention but never truly fades. As she passed by the piano once more, the lights above reflected softly on its surface. The keys were still untouched, waiting. She didn't stop. But this time, her fingers shifted slightly, as if remembering something on their own. Then, just as quickly, the moment was gone. She walked on, blending back into the rhythm of the evening, unnoticed and quiet, just like before. But something had already begun to change, even if no one else could see it yet. The evening moved forward with the same steady rhythm, but something in the air had shifted, even if it was too subtle for most people to notice. The hall was now completely full. Every table was taken, and soft music from hidden speakers filled the spaces between conversations. The grand piano in the corner remained silent, almost forgotten by everyone except her. She carried a tray of glasses across the room, her steps careful as always. A group near the window raised their hands slightly, asking for another round. She nodded and turned toward the service area, her focus fixed on finishing one task before moving to the next. It was how she kept everything under control. Thinking too much would only slow her down. Still, without meaning to, her eyes drifted again. The piano stood in the same quiet place, untouched. She quickly looked away. "Excuse me." The voice came from a table she had just passed. She turned back politely, her expression calm. A man sat there, dressed simply but neatly, not as flashy as some of the others. There was something different about him. He wasn't loud, and he wasn't trying to draw attention. He simply watched things carefully, as if noticing details others ignored. "Yes, sir?" she asked softly. For a moment he didn't speak. His eyes moved briefly toward the corner of the hall. "The piano," he said, nodding slightly in its direction. "Does anyone play it tonight?" She followed his gaze for a second before answering. "Sometimes, sir. But not tonight." He looked back at her, studying her face in a quiet way that made her slightly uneasy, though not uncomfortable. "That's a shame," he said. "A place like this feels different without music." She gave a small, polite smile. "Yes, sir." There was a short pause. Then he asked something she didn't expect. "Can you play?" For a second, she thought she had heard him wrong. Her expression didn't change much, but inside, everything paused. "I'm sorry," she replied, keeping her tone steady. "Do you play the piano?" he repeated, his voice calm, almost casual. She let out a small, quiet breath, the kind people don't notice. "No, sir," she said quickly. "I don't." It was the easiest answer, the safest one. But something in the way she said it didn't fully convince him. He didn't push right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, still watching her, as if trying to understand something unspoken. "I saw you looking at it," he said gently. "A few times." Her grip on the tray tightened just a little. "I just passed by it while working," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. "That's all." The man smiled faintly, not in a mocking way, but as if he understood more than she wanted him to. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it means something more." She didn't answer that. Instead, She shifted slightly, ready to move on. "Would you like to order something, sir?" But he didn't respond to that question. Instead, he said something that made her heart beat just a little faster. "Why don't you play something?" The words were simple, but they landed heavily. She shook her head almost immediately. "No, sir, I can't." Her voice was still polite, but there was a clear firmness in it now. He didn't seem surprised by her refusal. "I'm not asking for a performance," he said calmly. "Just a few notes." "That's not possible," she replied, this time a bit more quickly. For a moment they both fell silent. Around them the hall continued as usual. Laughter, conversations, the clinking of glasses. None of it stopped. But at that table it felt like everything had slowed down. The man glanced again toward the piano, then back at her. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "people hide things they're really good at." She didn't respond. Her mind had already started to pull back, building that familiar wall she had learned to rely on. "I think you're mistaken," she said after a brief pause. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe he would let it go. But instead of dropping the subject, he leaned forward slightly. "Then prove me wrong," he said, his tone still calm but now carrying a hint of curiosity. That caught the attention of a nearby table. Someone turned their head. Then another. The shift was small, but noticeable. She became aware of it instantly. This was exactly what she didn't want. "I really can't," she said, lowering her voice a little. The man noticed the change in her tone. This time he paused longer before speaking again. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said. "I just thought." He didn't finish the sentence. But the moment had already grown bigger than both of them expected. A few more people nearby were now watching. Not closely, not yet, but enough. She felt it, that quiet pressure building. Her instinct told her to leave, to end the conversation and move on to another table. That was what she always did. But something held her in place for a second longer. Maybe it was the way he asked. Maybe it was the piano sitting there in silence. Or maybe it was something deeper, something she had kept buried for too long. "I'm working," she said softly, almost as a final attempt to step away. "I understand," he replied. "Just 1 minute." She shook her head again, but this time, the refusal didn't feel as strong. More people were noticing now. Whispers began to form. "What's happening? Did he ask her to play? She works here, doesn't she?" The attention spread quietly, like ripples in water. She could feel it all around her. Her heart beat a little faster. This wasn't just a simple question anymore. It had become something else. Something public. Something she couldn't easily walk away from. For a brief moment, her eyes moved toward the piano again. It was still there. Still quiet. Still waiting. And suddenly, it didn't feel as distant as it always had. She looked back at the man. He didn't look demanding. He didn't look amused. He simply waited. That made it harder somehow. If he had been rude or forceful, it would have been easier to refuse. But he wasn't. He was calm, curious, patient, and that made her hesitate. "I haven't played in a long time," she said quietly, almost without realizing she had spoken. The man's expression softened slightly. "That doesn't go away," he said. She didn't answer right away. Her thoughts had already started to drift, pulling her toward memories she usually avoided. Her fingers shifted slightly against the tray again. That small, familiar movement. The kind that didn't belong to a waitress carrying glasses. The kind that belonged somewhere else. She noticed it, and quickly steadied her hands. "I shouldn't," she murmured. But the words didn't sound as certain as before. The room around her seemed to fade just a little. Not completely, but enough. Enough for her to feel that quiet pull again. The one she had ignored for years. The one she had learned to silence. And yet it was still there. Waiting. Just like the piano. The man didn't say anything this time. He simply watched. And for the first time that night, she didn't immediately walk away. She stood there caught between two choices. One familiar. One uncertain. The hall continued to buzz with life. But in that small space, something had begun to change. something that couldn't be undone easily. And deep down, she knew it, even before she made her next move. For a few seconds, she stood there without moving, the tray still balanced carefully in her hands. The noise of the hall continued around her, but it felt distant now, like it had been pushed far into the background. The man at the table didn't rush her. He simply waited, his expression calm, as if he already understood that this moment mattered more than it seemed. She lowered her eyes for a moment, trying to gather herself. "I really shouldn't," she said again, her voice softer this time, but even as she spoke, it felt like the words were losing their strength. A few more people nearby had started to pay attention. Not everyone, but enough to make her aware of it. A couple sitting at the next table had turned slightly in their chairs. Someone standing near the center glanced over, curiosity clear on their face. It wasn't loud or overwhelming yet, but it was growing. That quiet kind of attention that slowly builds without anyone realizing. She took a small step back, as if to leave. "I have work to do," she added, almost as a reminder to herself. The man nodded gently. "Of course." But he didn't look disappointed. If anything, he looked patient. That made it harder. If he had insisted again, she could have walked away without thinking twice. But his calmness left the decision entirely in her hands. And that was exactly what she wasn't ready for. She turned slightly, ready to move toward another table. But before she could take a full step, a voice from nearby spoke up. "Wait, is she going to play?" It was said quietly, but it carried. Another voice followed, a little more curious. "I think he asked her to." Now more heads turned. She felt it instantly, that gentle wave of attention turning into something more focused. Her chest tightened just a little. This was no longer a private moment. She paused again, her back still half turned. Part of her wanted to keep walking, to disappear into the routine that had always protected her. She knew how to do that well. Keep moving, keep working, don't stop long enough for anything to catch up. But another part of her didn't move. Stayed right there, holding her in place. Slowly, she turned back. The man was still watching her, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Around them, the whispers continued, soft but spreading. "She looks nervous. Maybe she actually can play. Why else would he ask?" The questions weren't loud, but they were enough. She felt every word, even when she pretended not to. Her fingers tightened slightly around the tray again. For a moment, she considered setting it down just so her hands would stop feeling so unsteady. "I haven't done this in years," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. The man heard her. "That's okay," he replied. "You don't have to be perfect." She almost smiled at that, but it didn't fully reach her face. Perfect. That word carried more weight than he realized. She slowly walked toward a nearby service stand and placed the tray down carefully. The small action felt bigger than it should have, like she was putting down more than just glasses. Her hands were free now, but instead of feeling lighter, she felt exposed. The room seemed louder for a moment, then quieter again, as if it was adjusting to what might happen next. She looked toward the piano. It was still the same, still quiet, still waiting. But now it didn't feel distant anymore. Now it felt close. Too close. Her steps didn't move right away. She stood there, staring at it, her thoughts pulling her backward. Not to the hall. Not to the present. But to a different time. A smaller room. A simpler place. Where the sound of piano keys had once been a normal part of her life. Where her hands had known exactly what to do without hesitation. Where she didn't have to think twice. The memory came quickly, but she pushed it back just as fast. This wasn't that place. This wasn't that life. She wasn't that person anymore. Or at least, that's what she had been telling herself for a long time. A soft clink of a glass somewhere nearby brought her back. She blinked, her focus returning to the hall. More people were watching now. Not everyone, but enough that it couldn't be ignored anymore. Some were smiling, curious to see what would happen. Others simply looked interested, like it was a small break from their evening. No one knew what this moment meant to her. To them, it was just something unexpected. To her, it was something she had avoided for years. She took a slow breath. Her heart was beating faster now, steady but strong. She could still walk away. Nothing was stopping her. She could pick up the tray again, return to her work, and let the moment pass. By tomorrow, no one would remember. Everything would go back to normal. That safe, quiet normal she had built for herself. But something about that thought didn't feel as comforting as it used to. Instead, it felt limiting. She looked at her hands. They were steady now, but she could still feel that faint memory in them. That familiarity. That quiet knowledge. It hadn't disappeared. It had just been waiting, just like everything else. She lifted her eyes again and looked at the piano. This time she didn't look away. The man at the table noticed. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just watched, giving her the space to decide. And slowly, almost without realizing it, she took her first step toward it. It was small, careful, but it changed everything. The whispers around the room grew slightly. She's going. I think she's actually going to play. People shifted in their seats, turning more fully now. The attention was no longer subtle. It was clear, focused, waiting. She felt it with every step. But she didn't stop. Her pace was slow, almost hesitant, as if she could still turn back at any moment. But she didn't. With each step, the distance between her and the piano grew smaller. And the distance between her and her past grew thinner. She reached it. Standing beside it now, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not fear. Not exactly. Something deeper. Something familiar. Her hand lifted slightly, hovering just above the surface. For a second, she didn't touch it. She just stood there, breathing, remembering. The room had gone quieter. Not completely silent yet, but close. People were watching openly now, waiting. She knew she couldn't stand there forever. It had already gone too far for that. So slowly, she pulled out the bench and sat down. The movement felt strange and familiar at the same time. Her posture adjusted without thinking. Her hands rested lightly in her lap. For a moment, she didn't look at the keys. She looked straight ahead, taking one more breath, one last chance to step away. But she didn't move. Instead, she finally lowered her gaze. The piano keys were right in front of her. Black and white, simple, quiet, waiting. Her fingers lifted slightly, hovering, not touching yet. And in that moment, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Because something was about to happen. Something no one expected. Not even her. For a moment, her hands hovered just above the keys. Unsure, almost frozen in place. The room had grown so quiet that even the smallest movement felt loud. A glass gently set down somewhere across the hall echoed more than it should have. Someone cleared their throat, then quickly stopped, as if afraid to break whatever was about to begin. She took a slow breath. Her fingers lowered slightly, brushing the surface of the keys, but not pressing them yet. That single touch sent a faint feeling through her, something both familiar and distant at the same time. It had been so long, and yet her hands still seemed to remember. She closed her eyes for just a second. Not to perform, not to impress anyone, just to find her place again. When she opened them, her fingers pressed down gently. The first note rang out. Soft, clear, simple. But it changed everything. The sound didn't rush. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed, filling the quiet space in a way that felt natural. A few people who had still been whispering stopped immediately. Heads turned more fully. The last bits of conversation faded without effort. Then came the second note. And the third. Each one placed carefully, like she was testing something fragile. The room listened. She didn't look at anyone. Her eyes stayed on the keys, her focus narrowing to that small space in front of her. The world beyond it seemed to blur. The pressure, the eyes, the expectations, they were still there, but they no longer felt as heavy. Her hands moved again, this time with a little more confidence. The notes began to connect, forming a quiet melody. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't try to impress. But it carried something real, something that made people stop without knowing why. A man near the back slowly set down his glass, his attention fully captured. A couple who had been in the middle of a conversation turned toward the piano, their words fading into silence. Even the staff paused briefly, glancing over before continuing more quietly than before. The hall was changing, and it was happening because of her. She didn't notice at first. She was too focused on the music. Her fingers moved more freely now, no longer hesitant. The pauses between notes became smoother, the transitions more natural. It was as if something inside her had unlocked, something that had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. The melody grew, not louder but deeper. There was feeling in it now, emotion that couldn't be explained with words, the kind that people don't expect, especially not from someone they had barely noticed just minutes ago. A woman seated near the front leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. Someone else blinked slowly, as if trying to understand why the music felt so different from what they were used to hearing in that room. Because this wasn't background music. It wasn't meant to fill silence. It was the silence, and everyone felt it. Her shoulders relaxed just a little as she continued. The tension that had been there when she first sat down began to fade. Her breathing steadied. Her hands no longer trembled. Instead, they moved with quiet certainty. She didn't need to think about where to place her fingers. They already knew. The memory wasn't in her mind. It was in her hands. The melody shifted again, becoming slightly more complex. Still gentle, still controlled, but with layers now. It rose and fell in a way that held attention without forcing it. People weren't just watching anymore. They were listening, truly listening. The man who had first spoken to her sat still, his eyes fixed on her, but not in surprise. More in understanding, as if he had expected something like this, even if he didn't know exactly what. Around him, others looked different now. Not curious, not amused, just quiet, completely quiet. A server walking past slowed their steps, careful not to make noise. A chair shifted slightly somewhere in the room, then stilled again. No one wanted to interrupt, because what was happening didn't feel ordinary, felt rare. She continued playing, her fingers moving with more ease now, gliding over the keys as if they had never left. The music carried a calm strength, something steady and honest. And then, almost without warning, the melody deepened again. This time there was something heavier in it. Not sad exactly, but full. Full of something that had been held back for too long. A few people felt it immediately. You could see it in their faces. A slight change in expression. A pause in their breathing. The kind of reaction that comes before someone even understands what they're feeling. She still didn't look up. She didn't need to. The connection was already there. Through the music. Through the sound. Through every note that filled the hall. The world around her had faded completely now. There were no trays. No tables. No expectations. Just the piano. Just the music. And for the first time in years, she wasn't holding anything back. Her fingers moved faster for a brief moment, then slowed again, creating a gentle contrast that made the melody feel alive. It wasn't perfect in a technical sense, but it didn't need to be, because it was real, and everyone could feel that. Time seemed to stretch. No one checked their phones. No one spoke. Even the smallest distractions had disappeared. The entire hall had become still, drawn into something simple yet powerful. She took another soft breath as her hands continued to move, and for a brief second, a small, almost unnoticeable smile touched her face. Not for the audience, not for anyone else, just for herself. Because in that moment she remembered. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough to feel like something lost had been found again. The melody began to slow, not ending yet, just easing. Like a quiet conversation coming to a close. Her fingers pressed the keys more gently now, letting each note linger a little longer. And still no one moved. No one spoke. The hall remained completely silent. Not forced. Not expected. Just natural. As if the entire room had agreed, without words, to stay in that moment just a little longer. And at the center of it all, she continued to play. No longer hesitant. No longer unsure. Just present. just real. And in that silence, she had already changed everything. The last few notes from her hands didn't end quickly. They slowed down, softer and softer, as if they didn't want to leave the room just yet. Each sound lingered in the air for a moment before fading. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, not moving anymore, but not pulling away either. For a brief second, nothing happened. No one clapped. No one spoke. The silence remained, deeper than before. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything the music had just carried. She stayed still, her eyes still lowered toward the keys. Her breathing was calm, but her heart was not. It beat in a steady rhythm, like it was catching up to what had just happened. She had not planned this. She had not prepared. And yet, something inside her had come forward without asking for permission. Slowly, she lifted her hands away from the piano. The moment her fingers left the keys, the silence finally broke. Started small. One person began to clap, then another, and then suddenly, the entire hall filled with applause. It wasn't polite or brief. It was loud, genuine, unexpected. People who had been sitting comfortably just minutes ago were now leaning forward, clapping with real energy. Some even stood up without realizing it. The sound echoed across the room, bouncing off the walls and filling every corner. She blinked, slightly startled by the reaction. For a second, she didn't move at all. It was as if she didn't quite believe it was meant for her. Her eyes lifted slowly, taking in the room for the first time since she started playing. Everywhere she looked, people were watching her. Not casually, not out of curiosity, but with something deeper. Respect, surprise, admiration. It was overwhelming. She wasn't used to being seen like that. The man who had asked her to play was on his feet now, clapping like the others. But unlike many in the room, his expression was calm, almost thoughtful. He wasn't surprised anymore. He simply nodded once, as if confirming something he had already believed. She looked away quickly, her chest rising slightly as she took a breath. This wasn't her place. Not like this. The attention felt too big, too sudden. Without thinking much, she stood up from the bench. The applause continued. Someone near the front called out softly, "That was beautiful." Another voice followed. "Where did you learn to play like that?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. The questions came too fast, and she wasn't ready for them. Instead, she gave a small, polite nod. Her hands lightly clasped in front of her as if trying to hold herself steady. Her eyes moved briefly toward the piano again. It looked different now. Not just an object in the corner. Not something distant, but something familiar. Something that had just brought a part of her back to life. She turned slightly, ready to step away. But the attention didn't fade immediately. A few people were still clapping. Others were still watching, waiting for something more. Felt like they expected her to say something, to explain, to share. But she didn't. She simply stepped back. One step, then another. Returning to where she had come from. Returning to the role everyone knew her for. A few guests tried to catch her attention again. "Do you play professionally? Why are you working here? Will you play another piece?" She offered a soft smile, but didn't stop walking. There were no clear answers she could give. Not here. Not like this. She reached the service area and picked up a tray, almost by instinct. The familiar weight in her hands grounded her again. It reminded her of where she was, of what her life had been for years. But something felt different now. The tray felt the same. The room looked the same. But she didn't feel the same. As she stepped back into the flow of the evening, the energy around her had changed. People looked at her differently now. Some smiled as she passed. Others nodded, as if they were seeing her for the first time. She wasn't invisible anymore, and that alone felt strange. At one table, a guest thanked her in a softer voice than before, holding her gaze for a moment longer. At another, someone simply said, "You're very talented." She nodded politely each time, but didn't let the conversations grow. She wasn't trying to become the center of attention. She just wanted to breathe, to understand what had just happened. From across the hall, the man watched her again, but this time he didn't call her over. He didn't need to. The moment had already passed. Or maybe it had just begun. As the noise of the hall slowly returned, conversations picking up again, glasses clinking, chairs shifting. There was still something different in the air. The music had left something behind. Something quiet, but lasting. She continued working just as she had before. But now, every time she passed the piano, she didn't avoid looking at it. She didn't rush past. She allowed herself to glance at it fully. And each time a small feeling returned. Not regret. Not sadness. Something softer. Something like possibility. For years, that part of her life had been closed, pushed aside by things she couldn't control. She had told herself it was gone, that it didn't matter anymore. But tonight had proved something else. It hadn't disappeared. It had only been waiting. Waiting for a moment. Waiting for a reason. Waiting for her. She paused briefly near the edge of the hall, adjusting the tray in her hands. Her eyes moved once more toward the piano. This time she didn't look away quickly. She held the gaze for a second longer. And in that quiet second, something settled inside her. Not a full decision. Not a clear plan. Just a feeling. A quiet understanding that things didn't have to stay the way they were. That something more was still possible. Even after all this time. Someone called her from another table, bringing her back. She turned, her expression calm again, and walked forward. The night continued. The hall remained full. The conversations carried on. But beneath all of that, something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to change the way she saw herself. Enough to remind her of something she had almost forgotten. And as she moved through the room once more, no longer invisible in the same way, it became clear that this moment was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something she had never expected to find again. The night slowly began to settle, though the energy in the hall didn't return to what it had been before. Something had changed, and everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't fully explain why. Conversations continued, laughter returned, and glasses clinked again. But there was a softer tone now, like people were carrying a quiet memory with them. She moved through the room just as she always did, holding a tray, checking on guests, clearing tables. From the outside, nothing about her looked different. She still worked with the same calm focus, the same quiet presence. But inside, things were not the same. Every step felt a little more aware. Every sound a little clearer. It wasn't overwhelming. It was subtle but steady. At one table, a couple thanked her again. This time with warm smiles that lasted longer than before. At another, someone simply nodded at her with a kind expression. No one pushed her to speak about what had happened, and she was grateful for that. She didn't have the words yet. Across the hall, the piano remained where it had always been. But now it didn't feel like something distant or out of reach. It felt like something that belonged to her again, even if she hadn't fully accepted it yet. She passed by it once more, her eyes meeting it without hesitation. This time, there was no rush to look away. A quiet breath left her as she continued walking. The rest of her shift went on, but it felt shorter than usual. Maybe because her mind wasn't as heavy. Maybe because something inside her had finally opened after being closed for so long. When the last guests began to leave, the hall slowly emptied. Chairs were pushed back into place. The lights dimmed slightly. The soft hum of voices faded into the background until only a few staff members remained, finishing their work. She wiped down one of the tables, her movements slower now, not because she was tired, but because she was thinking. Not in a worried way, just thinking. A few co-workers glanced at her from a distance. Some smiled. One gave a quiet thumbs up before turning away. No one made a big deal out of it, but the respect was there. And she noticed. For years, she had worked beside them, always reliable, always quiet. But tonight, they had seen something new. Something real. When she finished, she placed the cloth aside and straightened up. The hall was nearly empty now. The silence felt different from before. Not heavy, but calm. She looked toward the piano again. No one was around it. No one watching. No pressure. Just a quiet moment. Her steps moved slowly in that direction. This time, there was no hesitation. She reached it and stood beside it for a second, her hand resting lightly on its smooth surface. The reflection of the dim lights shimmered across it, softer now than earlier in the evening. She pulled the bench out again and sat down. Not because anyone asked. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Her fingers rested on the keys, and this time they didn't hover. They settled naturally. She pressed a note, then another. Soft, quiet sounds filled the empty hall, different from before. There was no audience, no expectation. Just her and the music. Felt peaceful. She played slowly, without thinking about perfection or mistakes. The notes came and went like quiet thoughts. Some were simple, some a little uncertain, but all of them felt honest. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about remembering. A memory came back to her again, of a younger version of herself, sitting at a different piano, learning, practicing, repeating the same piece until it felt right. Back then, there had been hope, plans, and a future that looked completely different from the one she had lived. Life had changed those plans. Circumstances had taken her in another direction. And for a long time, she believed that chapter had ended for good. But sitting there now, playing in the quiet, she realized something important. It hadn't ended. It had only paused. She let her fingers move a little more freely, the melody growing slightly fuller. The empty hall carried the sound gently, letting it echo just enough to feel alive. For the first time in years, she wasn't holding back. And it didn't feel strange anymore. Felt right. After a while, she stopped. Not suddenly, but naturally. The final note faded, leaving behind a calm silence. She stayed there for a moment, her hands resting on her lap now. Then she stood up slowly. There was no applause this time. No audience. But somehow it felt just as meaningful. Maybe even more. As she turned to leave, she noticed someone standing at a distance. It was the man from earlier. He hadn't interrupted. He hadn't made a sound. He simply stood there, having heard enough to understand. She paused for a second, unsure of what to say. But he spoke first. "That sounded like home," he said quietly. She looked at him, surprised by the words. Not because they were loud or dramatic, but because they felt true. She gave a small nod, her expression calm. "It used to be," she replied. He took a step closer, but still kept a respectful distance. "It still can be," he said. She didn't answer right away. But this time she didn't turn away either. The idea didn't feel impossible. Not anymore. They stood there in the quiet for a moment, no pressure, no expectations. Then she gave a soft, polite smile and nodded once more before walking past him. There was no long conversation, no big promises, just a simple moment of understanding. She picked up her things and made her way toward the exit. The night air outside was cool and calm. The noise from the hall stayed behind as the door closed softly. For a second, she stood still, taking it in. The world outside felt different somehow. Or maybe she was the one who had changed. She began to walk, her steps unhurried. Her life was still the same. Her responsibilities hadn't disappeared. Nothing had magically become easier. But something inside her had shifted. And that mattered. As she walked down the quiet street, her fingers moved slightly at her side, almost as if they were still playing invisible keys. A small, thoughtful smile appeared on her face. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because something that had been lost had finally found its way back. And this time, she wasn't going to let it disappear again.